Good evening, everyone. I begin by thanking the Archaeological Society of Alberta for inviting me to its speaker series. I'm really glad to be here, and to Calgary Public Library for hosting the occasion. There's also several donors to my book about Paul Kane in the audience. I acknowledge them and the support they provided so that it could at last be published. I started work on Paul Kane 37 years ago, and it was really the only research project I continued off and on, sometimes more off than on, throughout my career, and I really did have to retire to get it completed. It looks like an awfully long book and an awfully opulent book, but I really sincerely feel that it took the shape it did only because the materials in it dictated as much. So let me explain what it contains. There are three stages of the narrative of Paul Kane. The first are the writings he kept while he traveled, and I'll get to them and you'll see images and so on. The next is the draft manuscript written in Toronto after his travels. His travels occurred from 1845 to 1848. They extended from Toronto to the Pacific Ocean and back. The only artist to actually cross all the way to the ocean in the 19th century. And that draft manuscript is written in two hands, neither of them his. And then, of course, the best known of the stages is the first edition of Wanderings of an Artist Among the Indians of North America, which was published in London, England in February 1859 by Longmans and Company. So all of those texts appear in the book, and the book is structured by the structure of Wanderings of an Artist because it is the version that's best known. It's what bibliographers call the base text that I chose. But about 80% of the book is taken up by my discussion of the contents of each of those stages of the narrative. Every one of them contains material that's not in either of the other two, and sometimes, of course, they actually do coincide. But it's fair to say that Kane ceded or lost control of the narrative at a certain point, and the book did not appear until more than 10 years after his travels concluded. So there was lots of time for interference and intervention. His father wouldn't let him be educated. His father was very disappointed when his son told him he wanted to be a painter. You tell art history audiences this, and they all nod their heads because they've heard it so many times before. So he wrote phonetically, and then because he wrote what he heard from indigenous languages phonetically, it's sometimes a head scratcher to figure out what he meant. And let me acknowledge right now the help I got from linguists of various indigenous languages spoken by the groups whose territories Kane traveled through. And then, of course, there are his field sketches, and you can tell by this slide that this book emphasizes his field work, both what he wrote and what he sketched, as opposed to or over against the presentation of Indigenous people in the studio canvases, which made him famous and made him a lot of money, which are more or less in the vein of the noble savage representation. If I use the word Indians more than once in this talk, I'm using it not in quotation marks, but in lowercase italicized form. It's a coinage of the Chippewa poet and professor of literature, Gerald Visner, and he came up with that designation in order to draw attention to the constructedness of representations of Indigenous people by Euro-Americans and Europeans. So that's what I mean by it. Kane's sketches are set sometimes against the studio pictures for the purpose of comparison, and you'll get an example from me tonight when I put you to work, and also in terms of work by contemporaries. Catlin, Kane, Catlin preceded Kane, Carl Bodmer, John McStanley, and so on. Um, the method of the madness is to try and bring under discussion aspects of the field of book history, of fur trade history and the history of the West in the 5th decade of the 19th century, of art history, of course, but all of these in the service of ethno-history. We only know Paul Kane because of what he painted and his subject matter, whether people or landscapes were the cultures through which he traveled, and indeed went west in order to document. So that's the primary effort. Now, that said, I did not train in art history or in ethno-history. Because I didn't, that's part of the reason it took me 37 years to try and put these four fields together. But I think it's really important, and although it was a challenge certainly from time to time, the challenge that was presented was more structural than anything else, insofar as in my time in the academy, disciplines were content to produce silos and didn't speak, in my view, often enough to one another. So I found myself again and again working across disciplines, and there was an upside and a downside to that, and I hope that Paul Kane's travels is one of the upsides. But of course, that's for my reader to decide. In my talk, I'm going to take you through landscapes first, because I want to clarify how representational Kane tended to be as a sketcher, as an artist. He really wasn't interpretive. He tried to put on paper what he saw. And once you see that, it's easier to understand that he was trying to do the same thing in his sketches with respect to portraits that he drew. So that'll also give us a bit of a taste of his route. But then I'm going to move on to how Kane became, after his travels, a man of science, a Victorian term for people who gained authority because of what they knew. And it was very odd, but it happened that Kane took a place up in the realms of the science of the elite sciences of North America during his lifetime before he faded. And I'll use the visual and the verbal record to give you that. Here's a self-portrait on the left and a photograph of Kane after his travels on the right, just to familiarize you with his appearance as he saw himself. More than once he refers to himself as Redbeard, and indeed the Ojibwa gave him that name. Translates actually as red porcupine. I think he was a prickly one. When he got back from his travels, and I'm emphasizing his sketches in showing you this slide, his girlfriend, Harriet Peake Clench, whom he would marry 5 years later when he got a commission and could afford to propose, she put together the catalog. That's her handwriting on the left. That's a photo of her in the middle, and then Hugh Scobie, a Toronto printer, printed this catalog for an exhibition that ran for 9 days only in Toronto in November 1848, only 5 weeks after his return in mid-October. So right away we have a kind of fresh Kane, a documentary Kane, a Kane that really didn't have time to make too many changes to what he compiled while he was traveling. I'm going to show you some landscapes now. I have 6 fold-out maps at the end of volume 1 of the book, and then the ones that pertain to each of the other volumes are reproduced in the subsequent volumes. I'm going to start you on the North Saskatchewan River. So if you'll just bear with me here while I orient you, you obviously can recognize Lake Winnipeg here, and then he went up on the North Saskatchewan River with Hudson's Bay Company brigades and came upriver to Fort Carlton, which is here, about 80 kilometers north of modern-day Saskatoon, which of course is on the South Saskatchewan. Fort Carlton was on the north. And then along over to eventually make his way to Edmonton. And then once in Edmonton, the fur trade route had to go up to the Athabasca River. We'll get there. This is one of his typical renditions of the parkland in Saskatchewan, on the North Saskatchewan River. This one actually depicts Carlton House on the flats. There's a provincial park there now, and there's the full image again. Here's a different one. These are firmly in the tradition of the picturesque, where there's a heightened foreground, a sunken middle ground, often one that's well watered, and then a rising background to contain the view. Not so much of that, because we're on the prairie after all, in the parkland, but it's an adaptation of that well-known tradition and visual representation. Here's a sketch, uncolored, of Fort Edmonton, taken from about where the playing fields of McNally High School are, if you know Edmonton, looking across over at the Rossdale Flats, and then at Fort Edmonton itself. This is a different point of view, showing you the Indigenous encampment and the post at the top, which is right in front of where the provincial legislature is today. Okay, and so after he leaves Fort Edmonton, and anytime I show you a map, the names in black were current in Kane's day, and the ones in red were not, they're later names. But he has to take the 5-day horse trip up to Fort Assiniboine on the Athabasca in order to cross the mountains, because Athabasca Pass doesn't have a glacier. That's the one the fur trade used, and for a sustained 35-year period, they didn't want to, if they didn't have to, use the Fraser River. George Simpson, the inland governor of the HBC, had gone down the Fraser, and he knew damn well that you couldn't go back up it once you cleared the canyon. And that's really why the HBC used the Columbia, and why they were the major proponent of Britain not settling for the 49th parallel for the international border. They didn't want to lose any of that thoroughfare or indeed the trade that they enjoyed at Fort Vancouver, which is Vancouver, Washington. That's across the Columbia from Portland, Oregon. So up he goes, and then and boats upriver with Hudson's Bay Company Brigade. They're late. There was a gastrointestinal plague in Red River in 1846, and all the brigades were delayed. Everyone was sick. So Kane's late. He doesn't get to Jasper House until Halloween, and encounters a hell of a lot of snow going over the mountains as a result. Here's his first image of the mountains. It's easy to determine where that is. I've shown with this fuchsia arrow the direction that you're looking along Brule Lake or Brûlé Lake or Lac Brûlé, which is outside the boundary of Jasper National Park today. It was called Jasper Lake when Kane traveled, so there's a confusion there, because you can see another expansion of the Athabasca River called Jasper Lake. But that Jasper House in 1846 was the second location of that fur trade post. So coming off the boreal forest, which every traveler except one I know found it dreadfully boring, because black spruce isn't aesthetically all that pleasing to the eye. He heightened the mountains when he depicted them first, and so you can see from a photograph from the mouth of Solomon Creek, just downstream from the widening known as Brûlé Lake, what he did, but easy to recognize where, because all of us know the shape of Roche Miette. And this, the Bedson Range with Bedson Ridge at the end, and Black Cat Mountain, Arrington Hill, Boule Roche, and so on that lake. So certainly as a representational artist, he provided images that are very easy, if you have the help, as I did, of local Jasper people to pin down his point of view in many of them. Here we come to his depiction on the left of Pyramid Mountain, in the middle of the lower Palisade, and to the right the upper. the height of which he exaggerates, as you can see from this photo. I thank Kevin Hassan for taking these photos for me. He's not able to be here tonight, but he was a big part of the Jasper stretch of the book. There they are together, just for comparison's sake. This also helps us in terms of fur trade history, pin down exactly where the horse trail went. Once boats were exchanged for horses at Jasper House to make the trip over Athabasca Pass. And this is just sort of downstream from the horse corral, the horse paddock on the side of the river. Well, there's the highway there, and there's the river there, so if you need orientation. And of course, a bit of that got burned last summer. Okay, so we're at Jasper right here. One more picture in the vicinity of the town site is one that Kane adopted a point of view for that looks directly across the river at the bench and then Pyramid Mountain in behind it. So when Kevin took this photo, he was standing right near the portal for Jasper Park Lodge, if you know that road, looking across the river. This also helps us in terms of vegetation change, understanding what fur traders called the Athabasca Valley, which was the upper Athabasca, a savanna. So not densely wooded, not what burned last summer. Fire protection that ensued once Jasper was named a forest park built a fuel density that didn't exist when Kane traveled, and it wasn't what fur traders, grasses, not trees and meadows, savannas, not forests. That's a topic of its own that I won't dwell on here. But it was very sobering to realize last summer that we paid a pretty steep price for protecting forests. Okay, and then leaving Jasper, one goes upstream to the confluence of the Whirlpool River, a tributary of the Athabasca, and then up it. And it's going up it that one comes, for example, to what's now called Kane Meadows and Mount Kane, named for him. This is on the left a view of Mount Kane looking south, and on the right Mount Kane looking north with Edith Cavell in the far background. And a committee punch bowl, which is named for the governing committee, the London Governing Committee of the Hudson's Bay Company in 1825 by George Simpson. Kane did actually make a sketch, even though there was nothing but snow and ice when he was trudging through on snowshoes, having had to give up horses. And there's a photo from 1998 of a similar point of view of the bowl itself. So Kane's given us a great, in fact, unparalleled visual record of Jasper Park. It's something that, surprisingly, the park has never decided to make a big deal of. It's one of the distinguishing features of Jasper when compared to Banff. The fur trade went through Jasper for a sustained period of time, and it should the cultural history of that valley should be making more of it, in my view. But I'm really not an opinionated person. Sorry, I should make more of this. Once the Athabasca Pass and the committee punch bowl straddles the divide, so water flows out of it in both the Hudson Bay and the Pacific Ocean directions. Coming off the Grand Côte, which is a very steep hill, down to the Wood River, and then meeting the Columbia, which at this point is coming up from Golden and turning hard in about 250 degrees and coming down again to Revelstoke. So you know when you hit Golden, you look and the river's going that way, and it's coming this way when you come out of Rogers Pass. And the Mica Dam, they're now producing this Kinbasket Lake, the deep reservoir. So where the fur traders rendezvoused, and from now on, on his route. There's nothing really left of it. I mean, one historian calls the Columbia a series of puddles because of the reservoirs behind all the power dams on the river, and it was the fastest flowing big river on the continent. So it lost its character, and it's a good thing. Kane documented a bit of it. This is a picture of what were called the Dalles des Morts, which were only a few miles downstream from where Mica Creek came into the Columbia. And obviously you can tell from the name, Rapid of the Dead, that there were drownings there. It was a portion of the river, and I happened across some photographs by a Revelstoke photographer showing, it doesn't capture the deadliness of the river, but remember that brigades went both up and down the Columbia, so they had to track up a very dangerous piece of water here. And this is a more or less the same point of view that Kane adopted for his sketch of Dalles des Morts. And then we come a little farther down, so I'm going over to another map now. I'll try and orient you. This is Northport in Washington. There's the international border, and the Columbia is coming in here. We're coming down to Kettle Falls. There's a blow up of that area. It was the major fishing rendezvous for Indigenous people on the upper Columbia. And every point on Kettle Falls had a name, and every tribal group had a understood permission to fish salmon at that point, or on that edge of the water. It was all very carefully regulated. That's in another talk, unfortunately. But he's coming down, and when he's coming down the Columbia at this point, he's also starting. There's the confluence with the Spokane River, and starting to go. It's hard to remember, but the fur trade did go through desert, the Columbia desert of the state of Washington. We don't really associate that landscape with it. The Little Dalles, the upper Little Dalles, was this stretch of water where the river shrunk to just 20 yards. There's an account from 1921 that I'll read if I can in a second. But what's noteworthy here in terms of Kane as a representational artist is that he adopted a point of view to try to capture this scene and put the whirlpool that was so dangerous in it. In 1915, a British Columbia surveyor took a photo from almost the same point of view. So it's great to have that for comparison's sake, especially now that that part of the river is completely flooded. You can't see any of this anymore, of course. I'll put the two together while I read this. So from 1921, here's a colorful account. The impassable barrage comes 100 feet below the point where the left-hand torrent precipitates itself at right angles into the current of the right-hand torrent, and the two lines of whirlpools converge in a V and form one big walloping sockdolager. Him there would still be room for, to run by if he were woofing there alone, but his satellites won't have it. Their accursed teamwork is such that the spreading V above catches everything that comes downstream and feeds it into the maw of the big whirlpool as into a hopper. Logs, ties, shingle bolts, fence posts, all the refuse of sawmills and the flotsam and jetsam of farms and towns are gulped with a woof, and when they appear again, a mile downriver, they're all scoured smooth and round-cornered by their passage through the monster's alimentary canal. Well, that's one from one man who portaged. Didn't want to deal with that. Okay, so there are my landscapes. Let me go now, and I'm going to back into the sketches of people and the narrative by going ahead to the Paul Kane who returned to Toronto and became, thanks to this man, George William Allen, a well-to-do Torontonian. Allen commissioned in 1852 100 canvases by Kane. And this was, and still is, the largest ever commission that has been secured from another individual in Canadian art history. It allowed Kane to propose marriage to Harriet Clench, who had known him since the 1830s. It allowed him to have this house built on Wellesley Street in Toronto. There's a picture of it today, somewhat changed, and the name in the sidewalk on Wellesley Street. This was in 1853. He married Harriet in Coburg on the 16th of September. In 1855, when Canada did not have an exhibit at the Crystal Palace Great Exhibition in 1851 in London, but when Paris held its exhibition 4 years later in 1855, the Canada's exhibit had 4 paintings that Allen lent to it, and they were the only art on display in the Canada's exhibit. So you can see how Kane gradually is taking on a much greater profile in the history of what became a country, a dominion first and then a country. And it's not clear that he particularly wanted that to happen, but given the nature of Toronto and its ambitions, he was a very useful tool. He became a member of the Canadian Institute, the scientific body that was established by Sir Sanford Fleming, the guy who invented time zones. In 1850, they made Kane a member in 1855. Here's a guy who didn't write, really, didn't show much interest in reading, didn't have a lot of knowledge outside of the knowledge that he gained from his travel experience. He was taken under wing by Daniel Wilson, an archaeologist who came from Edinburgh in 1852 to be a professor at the University of Toronto. I'm showing a photo of him with the title page of his book. It didn't appear until 1862, and I'll come back to it, but he's best known for it, so I mention it now. His big challenge was to remain a monogynist at a time when so many North American ethnologists were polygynists. Wilson was a believing Christian, and he had to try and reconcile origins of man with the Christian story. But also many of the American ethnologists needed a theory to distinguish whites from blacks in their own country, so polygyny answered that need as well. I'm simplifying a very complicated debate that occurred in the 1850s, but here's Kane in the middle of people giving such questions their consideration. And Wilson is fascinated that Kane met Métis, and his interest in the mixing of blood among what the Victorians called races took him to Kane's house again and again to see sketches. And we have the record of the woman, Catherine Healy Doll, who kept the longest running diary in the 19th century in the English language, was in Toronto for 3 years, and she happened to meet and become friends with both the Kanes and the Wilsons. And she mentions how often she and the Wilsons were visiting the Kanes and looking at his work. But the displacement and extinction among the primeval races of man is the kind of article Wilson published to try and understand why Indigenous people were vanishing, because the vanishment trope was the discourse of the day. There's no way with the advent of the railway and quote-unquote progress that Indigenous people were thought to be capable of surviving the advent of Euro-Americans on the continent. It was simply accepted as forecasted. You can see that Wilson was the general editor of the Institute's, Canadian Institute's organ, the Canadian Journal, and he supervised the ethnology and archaeology section of it. And he was the editor at a time when one of the meetings of the Institute reported that Paul Kane read a paper on the habits and customs of the Walla Wallas, one of the North American Indian tribes, and that he read it from his own journal. This is nonsense, not only because what was read wasn't written by Kane, but because it wasn't even read by Kane. It was read by George Allen, his patron. The printed minutes don't say that. Papers were then read, you can read at the top of that snippet, by Paul Kane. But Allen did the reading. It wasn't even clear that Kane was present. Why? Well, he didn't present himself. I think he was a very good, he was, after all, he had Irish blood in him. I think he was a bit of the Blarney Stone in him, and he was certainly able to talk, but he wouldn't have written a paper and he wouldn't have read it. So that's one disabusement that I had to undertake to understand during the course of my work. And here, when it was published in the September issue of the Canadian Journal, it's by Paul Kane. And it was read before the Canadian Institute. Sanford Fleming has a note saying that this wasn't the case in any of the 3 articles that the journal published. That was 1856. The next summer, the American Association for the Advancement of Science took its annual meetings for the first time. It was their 11th annual meeting outside the country, and they took it to Montreal, 450 delegates. And this is the association that still publishes the journal Science today. I'm showing you Wilson, who was on the organizing committee, as was William Dawson, a geologist who was principal of McGill, and William Logan on the right, who had established the Geological Survey of Canada. This is really elite company that Kane suddenly, who was taken by Wilson to Montreal, finds himself in. It was held at Marché Bon Secours, and which was completed in 1847. So it was not an old building, but this conference really brought a lot of luster to Montreal. It was growing up much faster and was a much older city than Toronto. And it was the banquet hall, it was the convention center, as it were, of its day. And the Palais de Justice was attached to it. Some of the sessions of this conference were held there. Kane spoke at this conference 4 times. It's almost uncanny that could be the case. But he opened the conference. So the Natural History Society of Montreal sponsored the soirée that opened the conference, and it included the likes of the ex-president of the US, Millard Fillmore, back, when that office actually had some elite status attached to it. The Bishop of Montreal, Dawson, Logan, among many, many others. And this is an interesting passage that from Dawson's opening address. We believe that science knows no political tenets. The great physical laws of the universe are the same in all lands. Geological structure in animal and vegetable life are everywhere framed on one uniform type. We cannot attempt to nationalize science without losing its greatest results. But we are connected with our American scientific friends by still closer ties. We are one with them in language, institutions, and origin. Now, given all of that, including the business about science not being nationalizing, the next set of words is unbelievable. Descended with them from that great people that alone of the nations of the world has the vigor to beget children in its own likeness. Well, who isn't? Who isn't capable of that? It's not as though the British had cornered the market on vigor for procreation. Capable of maintaining an independent existence, we acknowledge their great nations as a brother. Their great nation as a brother. And we regret it not We regard it not as a prodigal that has left his father's house to waste his father's substance. Well, a lot of people actually did think that in the United States. But as an honorable adventurer who has departed from his paternal home to establish himself in honest independence, and we delight to welcome him as a visitor to our corner of the old homestead of John Bull. Remarkable for its day, but this is the kind of discourse that can remove Indigenous people. They're simply being supplanted. So they become a curiosity for science, given, you know, we better do what we can to record who they were, because they won't be around much longer. Into the midst comes Paul Kane. The party, this is from the newspaper report in the Montreal Transcript and Commercial Advertiser. The party then commenced its regular promenade through the rooms, the whole suite, including the city hall, mayor and councillor rooms being thrown open to the public. In the octagon under the dome, you saw the image of that, Mr. Paul Kane's very interesting collection of Indian curiosities and gallery of Indian paintings were displayed and were objects of much interest and admiration. 1,750 people attended this evening. And it was his studio canvases, and only his studio canvases, none of his sketches, that Kane exhibited. I'm going to concentrate now on one of them. This man, called a nez percé or nez perce, you can see the pierced septum and the dentalium that's put through it in this work. And then in the list of pictures that he sent to George Allen when he got all 100 of them completed, he calls this a nez perce or nez percé Indian. Okay, so we're talking about the part of the Columbia River just before its last great bend, coming out of the desert and turning a hard west turn to run down to the ocean and to go through the Columbia Gorge. So you can see it contextualized better over here. This is the Snake River, and that's the river with which the Nez Perce are particularly affiliated. Their own name for themselves, the Nimi-Ipu. But I'll say Nez Perce if you don't mind. So he's coming, and Kane decides on the 29th of July, 1847, he's on his way home at this point, that doesn't matter, that he's not going to stay with the brigade and fight their way upriver. He's going to go to Colville, which is where, sorry, do I have it here? No, I don't. But it's where Kettle Falls is. He's going to that fur trade post from Fort Walla Walla, which you can see there on the Columbia at the mouth of the Walla Walla River. He's going to go by horse because he's been told he should go and see the Grand Coulee. It'd be really worth sketching. Not a bad idea, but 29th of July, taking a horse through a desert, not knowing where he's going. Okay, before we get to that, let's have a look at the sketch from which this painting derived. First thing you notice is the nose isn't pierced. Face painting is very similar, but also the shirt's coming from somewhere else, the perforated, which is certainly a Nez Perce custom. We have to go to another sketch to find the shirt to be put on this man. So, and that sketch does not show a man with facial painting. So we've got that to contend with. And then we have, of course, what almost always happens when a sketch becomes a, excuse me, a studio painting. The way you create, I don't mean to talk down to anyone, I beg your pardon, but if you don't happen to know, that one of the ways you created a noble savage portrait was to elongate the neck and give someone broader shoulders. And this was routinely done. It was understood as the way you elevated the stature of your subject. So we got the perforated shirt from one sketch, and we've got the facial painting from another, and they're put together. But what I didn't know for the longest time, because the owner of the sketch never reproduced the entirety of the page, just the head, was that in the upper left-hand corner there was a number. And it took me years to figure out what all those numbers signified. but the ones because there's many on the sketches, both front and back, they all matter. And in these two little tiny books, I reproduce them to scale in my book, so you can tell by the size of mine that a page that shows them as their actual size gives you a good idea of how small they are. But all of Kane's field writings are in these two tiny books in a museum in eastern Texas. A long story. That number 91 corresponds, as you can see here, to, well, I'll read Tumse Naho number 90 first, because that's the man without blood who's a Spokane Indian. And then 91 is a Spokane on the river of the same name. So this man isn't Nez Perce, and the facial painting isn't traditional Nez Perce facial painting. But the portrait at the Royal Ontario Museum not only retains Kane's title, but then has the Royal Ontario Museum's designation of ethnographic identity as Nez Perce. That's the case with the studio oil. Meanwhile, we come back to 91 now that we know that it's a Spokane man, and go over to The Spokane Indians, a book by John Allen Ross, who spent 35 summers on the Spokane Reserve, living with the people and collaborating with them, and wrote without ever knowing that this was a Spokane painting. Facial painting and tattooing were art forms executed singularly or with a combination of red and black pigments. Black was made from different types of charcoal, used exclusively when tattooing the face with a series of straight lines. Red was the predominant choice of color for facial designs. So we have Ross in 2011 saying that for the first time. And then here we have, the indisputable authority of the Smithsonian Handbook of North American Indians, using not the sketch, but the studio oil, and continuing the erroneous but long-standing understanding that Nez Perce pierced the nasal septum. It's really unfortunate that the author of that chapter, who was the editor of the volume, ended up making that choice. But why wouldn't he? Because maybe he didn't even know of the existence of this, which is in Library and Archives Canada, and it too has a Nez Perce designation. Also, it doesn't help that you can't see it, but the number 91 is cut off at the top, so you can never get the number from it anyway, if you happen to know the portrait log. So between the two, the sketch and the painting, we've got this confusion. And at points, some of my book is only doing this very basic work, and how could it be that 150 years later we're still at this stage? But I'm sure people in archaeology would probably say the same thing. There's just so few scholars who work on Canada, in discipline after discipline after discipline. They all think the world's somewhere else. And maybe it's a little better now, I don't know, but I do know in the disciplines of history and English, way too many students just wanted to work on contemporary subjects, and so we weren't getting this basic work done. And I'm not saluting myself in saying that. I'm regretting that more of it isn't done, and because so much of it still needs to be done. Charlie Hill, the curator of Canadian art for many years at the National Gallery, whose book on Tom Thompson, probably you know if you know his name, said maybe your book will make people think twice before they say Canadian art started with a group of 7. But that's really how little we know. And because Kane didn't have any successors, no one went west and painted Indigenous people for decades after Kane. And the Treaty Commission, there was an illustrator finally at Treaty 8, but they weren't assigned to the Treaty Commission, so we don't have the benefit of that either. Okay, trying to get back on track after that digression. You can see that the Athenaeum, a weekly paper in England, its February 26, 1859 issue, advertises the availability of Paul Kane's Wanderings of an Artist. It's a demi-octavo, fairly small book, really. but selling for 21 shillings. It had 8 chromolithographs and 13 woodcuts. And that's what justified the price in the eyes of the publisher. 1,200 copies were printed. That's more than usual for a travel narrative. Luckily, of all the records of Longman's that survived, they were the business records. Everything else was bombed out of existence during the Second World War, when Mayfair was so hard hit. But Longman had transferred his business records to out of town, and even better in a way, they forgot where they'd sent them, so they remained intact for 30 years before anyone saw them again. But they show us how many copies were printed, and who did the woodcuts, who did the chromolithographs, and all those book history details that I don't have time for just now. There's the title page. You probably know it, and it's an expensive book today. I'll get to that. This is the copy that was owned by Alexander Cameron Rutherford, Alberta's first premier, and he had Kane's rendition of Fort Edmonton painted on the foredge of the book in his copy. It's a wonderful copy to examine. Okay, I'm going to come back now to the 29th, 30th, and 31st of July, when Kane takes it into his head to take a horse trip across the desert to see the Grand Coulee. And this is what his field notes have. You can see the writing on the left in my transcription. Left Walla Walla for Colville by the way of the Grand Coulee on horseback, past the Nez Percé, that's the river, not the people, swimming the horses, and camped 20 miles from Walla Walla. My man says that he does not know the road. So Kane finds the guide, a Métis man, whom he finally got to go with him. I don't know how. It's such craziness that he finds out on the 29th after they leave that he doesn't know where he's going. And then on the 30th, went 30 miles and camped, lost my pistols. The man went back for it. Crossed, and on the 31st, crossed part way of the first great bend of the Columbia, found my horse bad. No kidding. I've used the end papers of each of the volumes. These, usually they're left empty in books, and I thought, well, they don't need to be empty, to provide 16 images of various pages of Kane's writing that I then refer the reader to, so that you can get used to Paul Kane and who he was once the narrative starts escaping his control. These are the 4 hardback books in which the draft manuscript that's written in 2 hands, neither of them his, appear, and they're reproduced at scale as well. So these are 2 pages showing them, so you can compare the sizes of them. There's the handwriting in the draft manuscript at this stage, which you can see the transcription of here. I remained at Walla Walla until the 29th. And then into the narrative starts creeping detail. You just saw the field writing, that's pretty sparse, that there's no basis for in the field writings themselves. So suddenly the Indians have a superstitious dread. Invariably the Indians, and I'm going back now to Visner's coinage, the Indians become what I call 5 V's Indians: vain, vengeful, vicious, violent, vanishing. And this is the way the narrative shows you this, or the way it starts to accrue. So they're superstitious, rather than they have a pretty good idea why you wouldn't ride a horse through a desert on the 29th of July. And they attach evil agencies to the spot. He therefore got a half-breed who agreed to accompany him. But then there is an ethnographic detail that's particularly interesting, and that's the dried salmon, the best of which were dried after the Indian fashion in a miserable eating. And it's invariably full of sand. Well, that's what Washington's like, part of the state, which so effectually grinds down the teeth of those who live solely upon it, that it is difficult to find an Indian over 50 years of age whose teeth rise the eighth of an inch above the gums. But we could get nothing better. Kane would never use that kind of phrasing. We could get nothing better. It's too sophisticated, and gradually the persona of Kane in the narrative grows into that of an English gentleman who's repulsed by Indigenous people, not so interested in them that he's sketching like crazy and writing down what he can remember that he's learned about them. We passed on about 20 miles, swimming our horses across the mouth of the Nez River and camping on the banks of the Columbia. The next day, while he's still waiting for the guide to come back with his pistols, I observed a canoe containing 4 or 5 naked Indians streaked all over with white mud, the ordinary pipe clay. These fellows on landing showed much surprise at my being there alone and watched me suspiciously for 2 or 3 hours. I returning the compliment, my gun in hand, ready cocked. So, can you imagine being an Indigenous person thinking, WTF, there's no one with this guy, his horse is languishing, is he on a vision quest? What's he doing exactly? Does he need help? Is he a bad guy? Prepared, but of course it's them who are encroaching on him. And they're the evil force. I don't need to read all of this, but he spends the whole night worried for his safety. There's even more of this once we get to the book stage. And then on the 31st, relatively straightforward, but more explanation about the route taken. Okay, so now we go to the book, which you can see here. Don Lake, a Toronto bookseller, wants $10,000 for his copy of. And that speaks to a whole business about the value of this proto-ethnography in today's eyes until it gets investigated. So at last now, there's a half-breed. I'm looking at the right now at the first edition, and he's got a name, this guy. His name's Donnie now, although ignorant of and he's also already ignorant of the road before he leaves with Kane. So Kane, he's only accompanying Kane. He's not his guide by any means. Riding horses and carrying our provisions, and on we go. No mention of the salmon at this point. And then we get the first indecency, and that's the stealth by Nez Perce of the tin cup. A valuable article in that part of the world, I suppose, as a souvenir of my visit. I took a sketch of a man and might have frightened the chief into getting the cup restored to me by means of this sketch, but I had been so warned of the treachery and villainy of these Indians that I considered it too dangerous an experiment. 5 V's Indians. They're bad guys, they're going to kill you sooner or later. Maybe sooner. And on it goes. And this is what everyone read when they read Wanderings of an Artist. This was the only stage of the narrative anyone knew. And then we go on more about the double-barreled gun and so on. And then it becomes almost laughable at the end. Fearing for my safety, I took good care not to encourage their close acquaintances, as I had no wish to have my immortality tested by them. That's just Victorian schlock, ladies and gentlemen. It's nothing other than that. If you read enough Victorian literature, it's not too hard to identify. It's just that travel literature claims the authority of the eyewitness observer, and the reader is willing to suspend her or his disbelief that it's anything other than the eyewitness observer's observations. This started as early as Mandeville's Travels, which came out in 1375, so when Chaucer was writing. And in that book, you find out that people who live in South Asia have their eyes in the middle of their chests, and all kinds of stuff that, because travel literature always had the assignment to both instruct and entertain, was willingly supplied. Mandeville being a Belgian and had left Belgium and certainly didn't travel, But armchair travelers created some of the best travel literature. That's just the nature of the genre. I might have missed something here, but no, I don't think I did. They steal the tin cup, and then they threaten his life, and he needs his gun to fend them off. And then at the bottom, just a little, on the right-hand side, just a little mention of the salmon itself. And then on the 31st, a barren, sandy desert. So now it's sounding a bit like Don Quixote and Roxanante and Sancho Panza. And the Castle Perilous, which is in Don Quixote, is just an inn. But, you know, why not start imagining that this is a kind of quest, but a quest that has nothing to do with a vision quest that an indigenous person might have, but rather harkens back to a literary formula. So that's all I'm going to do with that. It's just a snippet. It's a lot of what the book does at different points. I wrote an article in the Globe Mail back in March about working with a group of Ojibwa at Whitefish River First Nation, north of Manitoulin Island. It was just terrific to talk to school kids about what happened to Shawnawasui, the Ojibwa leader, in chapter 1 of Wanderings of an Artist. And the school on the reserve is named the Shawnawasui School after this great leader of these people. So they were particularly interested, believe me. You can do this almost anywhere, but setting the record straight is, and I'm going to take the last few minutes just to take you over to the coast to give you an idea of what's happening there. Here's Kane's rendition, back to a landscape for a moment, of Mount Baker from Mount Douglas, from the park in Victoria, which now carries a Cowichan name. But it's pretty representative. There's a photo showing the same scene, and in the same, pretty much the same place in the sketch is Cormorant Point and Cordoba Bay. So we think we got the right point of view for this one, and it tells us that Kane took a hike one day from Fort Victoria. And then his rendition, and I love this sketch because it shows different people, although they're in a commercial exchange, cultural relationship, living similarly in their own ways, right beside, across the water from each other. Fort Victoria on the right and Indigenous village on the left. So if we take a point of view, here's the spindle whorl. So Songhees, a Salish artist, produced 7 of these spindle whorls that dot the landscape around the city of Victoria. Perhaps you know them. This one's on the site of where the fur trade post was. And then across the water, well, I'll just show you for a moment. This is important because the Royal Ontario keeps getting this wrong. They keep telling people that this rendition occurred in the Esquimalt Harbor, and the Esquimalt Harbor is up where the end of the Purple Arrow is, way up the coast. But there's an Esquimalt Peninsula in between, and the very end tip of it is called Songhees Point. Okay, so this rendition is from more or less the bottom of James Bay. Here's the Empress Hotel, here are the Parliament buildings. From about here, looking up, there would be the fort, there's Songhees Point. So that's what we're getting in this rendition. Lovely and delicate one. Enough detail in the village on the left that anthropologists have been able to use this picture. Okay, so in the field writings, in the portrait log, number 44, is an entry about Chiaclac or Chiaclach. And there's my transcription. Chief of the Songhees, number about 500 warriors, live on the south end of Vancouver's Island in the Straits of Tefuka. I crossed the straits with this chief and 4 of his tribe. Once we get to the draft manuscript, what do we find? Well, you can read it, but it's easier maybe to have the transcription. Chiaclac is the head chief of the Songhees. And these are Flathead Indians, numbering about 500 warriors living in a village. And you can see that it's located in the same place, Vancouver Island. Songhees is never mentioned in Wanderings of an Artist. So when we get to the book and come to this statement, on the opposite side of the harbor facing the fort stands the village of Clallam Indians. They boast of being able to turn out 500 warriors armed chiefly with bows and arrows. Who made that change? And although Clallam tended to be a regional name for many peoples, someone decided that that distinction needed to be drawn. I happened to meet at a conference two researchers, Dorothy Kennedy and Randy Bouchard, you might know them, who asked me after hearing a presentation, so what, do Kane's writings have anything to say about this statement? And I said, I don't know, I'll check, because I didn't know the field writings intimately at that time, which was not 2002. And lo and behold, no, it's Songhees. Did it matter? Yeah, it did, because the lawyers for the governments of BC and of Canada who were defending the case about the land on which the provincial legislature of BC sits, being Songhees and Esquimalt land, and therefore having the governments, both of them, having to provide some recompense for the use of them, they realized how much they were depending on the eyewitness expert, Paul Kane, who was there in April 1847, very early. The fort only started building in 43. His book said they were Clallam. So Clallam didn't have a claim. They're mainly US American indigenous people, although there's certainly some Clallam on near Beecher Bay and that part of Vancouver Island. They wanted, they wanted the claim dismissed. $31.5 million later, that suit was settled out of court, and it was settled in part, not by any means entirely, because of the testimony that Kane's own field writings provided, the law firm that was representing the Lekwungen, that's the Esquimalt and the Songhees. So yeah, these things matter. Here's Chiaclach, and the rendition of the sketch on the left, and the heightened neck and everything else on the right of the Noble Savage rendition of him. You can think, in particular, the eyes and the mouth. Well, I won't tell you how to read these, but I think it's fair enough to say they're different, and they convey a different person. Okay, one last example. In 1862, Wilson refers liberally to Kane time and again in his book. He had 3 editions, and Kane kind of fades by 1876, but he uses him quite a bit, and he uses a woodcut of one of Kane's sketches, calling him annuity chief. So this is one of the groups of people that used head reformation as a means of establishing identity as status. It was really just slaves on the northwest coast that had round heads. So this is the sugar loaf formation, and you can see down at the bottom, Paul Kane II in black ink is repeating what in graphite is written above these words. Woodcut, head and shoulders only, so that's referring to Wilson's book. In the upper left-hand corner, thankfully, there's a number, and that takes us to the portrait log, and in it, annuity chief. This tribe live on the north end. Please take note of that, Vancouver's Island, and make their heads a conical shape by twisting a band around the head when, I think that ends when young. And in 1848, just when he got back to Toronto and showed only sketches for 9 days, Kane numbered this one, annuity chief, north end of Vancouver's Island. The Annuity Indians have conical shaped heads. But there we have the confusion at the Stark Museum in Orange, Texas, that simply makes Nuity and Nootka the same people. And Here's the studio rendition of this image. I mean, there's only 100 studio canvases, so not every sketch has a studio version. But the Royal Ontario Museum does the same thing. Conical shape-headed man, Nuchalnath, or Nootka. When the first edition of Wanderings of an Artist published in Canada came out, there was a list at the start of it showing the pictures in the Royal Ontario Museum. All 100 of them ended up there. It's a different story, different talk. But an Indian with conical shaped head, chief of Nuitians, the north end of Vancouver's Island, and then a reference to Wilson's book. Okay, well, let's go to the north end of Vancouver's Island. The north end of Vancouver's Island, sorry, I don't mean to rush the maps, but I don't know that they're easy to read otherwise. So up at the north end, way at the top, we have the Nawati River, we have Nawati Lake, we have Nawati Mountain. That is the home of these Kwakiutl people. They have nothing to do, including language, with the people who live in Nootka Sound, Nuchalnath, who speak a southern Wakashan language as opposed to a northern. There's 260 to 300 kilometers by air between these two parts of the island, but they're confused. And they're confused institutionally, and even Kane was happy to confuse them. It didn't matter once he was back in Toronto. No one was going to question his authority. So we have the Redbeard on the left, and Kane was complicit from time to time, especially on the art side. Who knows on the narrative side what the heck was going on. But we have the gentleman on the right who gained stature and was a prominent figure in Toronto scientific society in the 1850s. But as I said at the start, I wanted to emphasize the field work. So I'd rather close by reminding you of the red porcupine than the man that it became subsequently. I thank you for your attendance and your attention.